Good afternoon and welcome to the Credit Suisse Global Women's Financial Forum. My name is Angela Osborne and I'm the EMEA Head of Client and Key Account Management. I'm delighted to be your host today and we appreciate you all joining virtually, and something that we hope in the not too distant future will not be the case, and quite poignant for me as I stand alone in an auditorium with my broadcast team. Over the past 4 years, we've been very proud at Credit Suisse to host the Women's Forum, which is aimed at thought leaders focusing on current themes, trends, and importantly, investable ideas. And these range from everything from sustainability to digitalization, and importantly, diversity and inclusion. Today's topic is the future of work, which is not just aimed at women, it's something that is affecting us all. The pandemic has had a profound and devastating effect on society as a whole, and we know that we're all trying to think about what the future is going to look like and what the new norm will be. So with that, we're delighted that you could join us today, and I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Margaret Heffernan, CEO, author of 6 books, and a professor at the University of Bath on School of Management. And Margaret will talk a little bit about what the future of work will look like. Over to you, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Angela, and thank you everybody for joining today. So here we are, a pandemic, another economic crisis, political volatility, the climate crisis. What on earth does the future hold? Nobody knows. The experts in forecasting say that if you're very open-minded and you consult a very broad cross-section of information sources, if you keep updating your forecasts and always assign probabilities to them, then perhaps the furthest out you can look for a reasonably accurate forecast is 400 days. 400 days. If, like the rest of us, you're not quite that meticulous, the horizon is maybe 150 days. And even then, human life remains full of uncertainty with events that no one can see coming. The story of what we should do, shouldn't do, is only ever going to be available in a rear view mirror when all the data's in. And even then, we'll probably disagree. But in the meantime, here we are. We're in it. The transformation we talked about for so long, so theoretically, is here. And I think that part of what we're feeling right now is a change from having lived in a complicated world to a complex one. In a complicated world, we could forecast, plan, execute, what I think of as a sort of three-legged stool of management. In a complicated world may have thousands of moving pieces, but it's linear, it's subject to efficiency, and it has patterns that repeat themselves. So we can feel in control, and we can plan, and we can operate on a just-in-time basis. But now, thanks to globalization and pervasive communications, we're in a complex environment, which means that there are patterns, but they don't repeat themselves predictably. There are too many forces acting on too many other forces, and it can feel like living in the middle of a 3D pinball machine where expertise struggles to keep up. And it's where very small things can have a huge impact. In complex systems, the last thing that happened is almost never informative about what's coming next. So now we have to start thinking about just in case. The manufacturers of plastic straws didn't plan for an almost overnight obsolescence of their products. Producers of films and plays and concerts didn't plan for indefinite closure. Even though we know climate change is real, California, Oregon, Washington, Australia couldn't plan for the scale of their forest fires. This is what happens as we lose the power to predict. The temptation is to think, oh, we just need more data. But that doesn't always solve the problem. The data shows us climate change, but it can't predict specific forest fires or crops flooding. In my book, Uncharted, I wrote a lot about epidemics, but not because I saw this one coming, but because it's a perfect image of uncertainty. We know epidemics are always with us, they will always happen, but because each one is unique, we don't know where they're going to start, when they're going to start, and we can't predict what the pathogen will be. So that's sort of the heart and soul of uncertainty, that it is unquantifiable, and that much about it is generally certain, but specifically ambiguous. And data alone can't fix that for us. But I don't think that leaves us helpless. I think it means that we now need organizations that are febrile in their sensitivity, highly alert to very small shifts in the ecosystem, profoundly aware of how every piece in that system works, and completely focused on maintaining its health and well-being, which means that leadership can no longer reside only at the top. It has got to be everywhere. We saw glimmers of this at the start of the pandemic. Instinctively, most leaders seemed to understand that their key priority had to be to look after their people. And to their amazement, they found that when they did that, productivity went up. That the working from home that everybody had so long distrusted, thinking, oh, this is just a charter for slackers, it really paid off. Caring about people really works. By necessity, lots of people have had to move to all kinds of smaller ad hoc teams, and leaders have had no choice but to trust their people to know what to do and to keep moving. And what they keep finding is that absent the hand of so-called scientific management, their workforce is creative, full of committed improvisers who themselves are full of good ideas. So the challenge now is, can we sustain that? How do we keep it going? Brand new research from Veronica Hope Haley into trust during the pandemic shows that by and large, people trust their leaders and they trust them more now, but they want to be fed better information and they want to have access to more knowledge that pertains to their work. They know that they have more to offer and they want the tools they need to deliver. In a future where creative responsiveness can make the difference between success and failure, informed participation is one answer to complexity and uncertainty. We saw this trend emerging pre-pandemic, but I think it's more relevant now than ever, now that all of us see what uncertainty really means and feels like. I did some work with the Chief Data Officer at the Bank of England. The Bank of England famously said, we know there will be future banking crashes. We don't know when they'll start. We don't know where they'll start. And we don't know what will kick them off, only that they'll happen. The Chief Data Officer knew that in this environment, and because of increased regulation, he was going to be under pressure. His whole team would be under pressure to deal with more data and to provide more analysis. And he was also seasoned and savvy enough to know that he wasn't going to get any more resources to do this. So what was he supposed to do? Traditionally, he would have taken his leadership team off to a swanky hotel somewhere, and they would have had to work through the weekend together and done a restructuring, some kind of reorg, trying to find ways to make the organization more productive. Or he could have just, made everybody work harder in the hope that that would somehow work and be sustainable. But instead, he thought, well, the thing I understand about complexity is that if you really want to understand what's going on, you have to do experiments. So he did a really interesting experiment, which is he explained the problem to the entire organization, and then he asked them to outline experiments which they thought might release trapped productivity in their organization. And he got quite a lot of them. Now, some of them didn't turn out so well, right? So somebody thought, well, we spend too much time trying to understand why we're doing what we're doing. If we could all sit in the senior leadership team meeting, that would be great. So he tried it, and everybody discovered senior leadership team meeting was kind of boring. and they stopped coming. It was a cost-free experiment. But somebody else suggested that the regular assessment routine was dull, unconvincing, and useless. So they revamped that completely, which radically increased employee engagement. Way down at the very most junior level of the organization, some young engineers had an idea for different ways of coding the data that might make analysis faster. They tried that on top sample data, 10x improvement. What was so interesting about this, the chief data officer told me, was two things. First of all, he didn't realize how much freedom he had to do experiments. And neither, he said, did he realize how much good strategic thinking there was at every level of the organization. Open innovation platforms have shown us much the same thing, how hard problems can frequently be solved by people working outside their domain expertise. And they volunteer, and these are where people volunteer detailed solutions to hard problems for the joy of doing so and the respect that they win from their peers. The chief value of finding all those different perspectives on the problem is that it provides a far greater range of possibilities and solutions. And volunteering is much more energizing than waiting to be picked, and it reveals so much more talent inside an organization. I think leaders are starting to get this right at the top of organizations too. I think it partly explains why we've been seeing the rise of open strategy, involving the whole of an organization in thinking about its future. As practiced by companies large and small, Virgin, Pixar, HSBC, or Philips, open strategy has a lot of different flavors, from the simplest crowdsourcing of ideas to significant and sustained collaboration across the hierarchy. But the point of engaging everyone in strategy is that it acknowledges and releases the power of collective intelligence. It acknowledges that there's more knowledge at the edge than at the center, and that this is the very best way to reap the true rewards of diversity, to capture the real value of multiple perspectives, which is where more and better insight comes from all across the organization. Right now, I mean, in the last 6 to 9 months, I've seen this take a couple of new and different forms. Some companies have started putting younger people on their boards because they recognize that they're making decisions and that the younger generations will really have to grapple with. And they want some insight as to, how do you think this plays out? Is this a responsible decision for future generations? I've seen other companies start to create shadow boards that reflect the age and the gender and the ethnic and sexual diversity of the societies they serve, knowing that they need this input, they need these perspectives for the organization to stay in tune and stay relevant. And the shadow boards are advising the formal boards in order that those senior leaders have a different way of seeing the world and the role of their business within it. I think these trends have forced a big rethink, because the pandemic also made us see, whether we wanted to or not, just how far our organizations and our lives depend often on the least visible and the least rewarded in our workforce. It's changed a lot of thinking about where the real value of the work comes from. And today, I think we're having all to think about this, because after all, there's no point asking people to go back to work for the company or for the economy if the economy and the company isn't working for them. As leaders, we now have got to consider the common good to which everyone in our organizations wants to contribute. A trend that's just beginning, but which is making some companies do a very big rethink. Because one of the things I've seen in the transformation accelerated by the pandemic, as I've worked with companies all over the world, from startups to large global companies, is that they fall roughly into one of two camps. The first have managed working from home really well, but apart from that, they haven't actually changed very much. Their leaders are quite eager to get back to the office. Their workforces, by and large, are not. Nevertheless, they're kind of sticking to their original plan. They're looking back quite a lot. I think there's quite a pervasive sense of sadness. And they're okay. They have a sense of loss, but they're not wildly energized. I'd say they're kind of stuck, trying to follow a recipe without really the ingredients in the kitchen that they need. Others have managed working from home too. This is the second group. A lot of them were doing a lot of flexible working anyway, so it was easy for them. But now that everybody has settled, they're taking stock. And what they're doing is they're saying, okay, we're in a very different place here. So let's see what we've got. What are our assets? What are the advantages we have? What are the relationships that are really valuable to us? And how do we reconfigure those now in order to stay really relevant and really meaningful to the way that the world is now? These organizations are much more future focused. They feel themselves to be at the beginning of something new, and they're very energized and excited. The second group, of course, is starting to consider and appreciate the role of purpose, if it's to have any purpose at all, to recognize that purpose has to mean something real to everyone. It can't just be a marketing slogan or a tagline. And the way for a purpose to really achieve reality is to ensure that it comes from everyone, but also that it connects at a personal level with everybody in the firm. That's what gives it energy and commitment. And that's why when Paul Polman redirected Unilever to decouple growth from environmental degradation, he didn't just do that at some kind of lofty strategic level, but drove it down through programs to identify how each individual sense of purpose connected with Unilever's own direction. He wanted to make the work personal. That, he told me, is how we accelerated the company's rate of innovation and made the business itself more rewarding for employees, for partners, for suppliers, for customers, and also for shareholders. So what does this mean in purpose? Sorry, what does it mean in practice? It really means seeing the workforce as sources of insight, intelligence, and solutions. I think it means the same thing for suppliers and customers and partners, not as costs, but as value. After all, companies don't have ideas, only people do. And that means being able to maintain real relationships of reciprocity, generosity, and trust with all of them. If you like, this is sort of teamwork on steroids. For all that we've been talking about teamwork for decades now, it's amazing how everyone still struggles with it. They should have, but they can't quite find collective intelligence. I think we've all had this experience of being in teams, some of which are fantastic, and we all grow and develop, and many of which are stuck and dull and tedious, and we can't wait to get out of them. Some of the best academic work I've seen on this subject comes from Tom Malone, who did a beautiful experiment trying to understand why is it that some groups work so much better together. And what he did is he brought in hundreds of people and he tested their IQ and he gave them problems to solve and discovered, which was no surprise to anybody, that there's a rough correlation between problem solving and IQ. But then he put people inside teams and gave them much harder problems to solve together. And he found what our experience would validate, which is, yes, some of them were terrific and some of them were terrible. But of course, the heart of this experiment was, what's the difference? So the first thing that's so interesting about this work is the first thing that is what doesn't make the difference. So the teams with the highest aggregate IQ, not the highest performing teams. Putting all the smartest people together didn't make a gigantic impact. Neither did putting one or two IQ superstars into a group. Instead, the really high achieving groups of people, high levels of collective intelligence, shared three characteristics. The first of these was that they scored very highly on a different kind of test, which is called a reading the mind in the eye test. It's roughly considered a test for empathy. And it's about how connected am I to you? How much do I pay attention to you? How much do I notice if you're kind of zoning out or not interested or not listening? Teams that scored highly on this were capable of finding more better solutions faster. The second characteristic of these outstanding teams was that when they played back the recordings of the problem-solving sessions, they discovered that each person made roughly an equal contribution. In other words, there were no passengers and neither were there any dominant voices. So they were getting the full participation of everyone. And the third thing they found, which I know came as a big surprise to these particular researchers, is that they found that the teams that did best also had more women in them. Now, nobody really has figured out why that is. It may well be women tend to score more highly on the reading the mind in the eye test, so maybe you're just getting a doubling down in the empathy quotient. But the key thing here, which I think is so important in this context, where collective intelligence is so important in identifying where we are and where we're going, the key thing is that what made the difference was what was happening between people. One way I think of it often is that actually it's the mortar more than the bricks that counts. Another way of thinking about this is the way that sociologists do. So in times of great stress, sociologists noticed that in a single neighborhood, you could have a street that was clean and pristine and safe, and right next to it, a street that was violent, crime-ridden, filthy. What they wondered made the difference between these. Why was one street apparently resilient and the other was not when they were experiencing exactly the same levels of stress? And what they discovered is that the clean, safe streets were lived on by people who knew each other. Now, they weren't each other's best buddies. They weren't spending all their time together, but they knew each other well enough to kind of cover each other's back and pay attention to what was going around in terms of what might threaten the whole. And what they decided was that this knowing each other, which they termed social capital, this social capital made areas more resilient. And I think that when we contemplate the shocks and threats that we face today, it's that resilience that we're in need of. Now, I don't kid myself that, convening, listening to, and making collective intelligence in organizations is simple. I've run 5 businesses. I know it's not simple. I know it's hard work. But I also think that it's better work. It's better for an unpredictable world because it surfaces more information and more solutions faster and more broadly. It's better as a source of a firm's coherence and the source of a firm's legitimacy. And I think that it's better for people. Because we all know and we all feel that we live in a very testing time. Stress, anxiety, grief, loneliness are common now. But when I talked to CEOs who had led their businesses through existential crises, so these were moments when their companies teetered on the brink of extinction. several things really surprised me. The first was that in telling me these stories, some 10 or 20 years old, each of these CEOs at some point wept, just remembering how tough it had been. And because they did, I was prompted to ask the question, if this was so terrible, if simply remembering it is so painful, what on earth got you through it? And their answers surprised me, but it was the same for each one of them. Oh, they said, it was my friends and colleagues that got me through it. And one elaborated, he said, you know, when you've worked with people together for a long period of time, you go a long way to help each other out. And then he added rather bitterly, it's pretty much the opposite of the gig economy. In an age of crisis, what gets people through is each other. It's the source of mental health for individuals. It's the source of mental health for organizations. We have many sources of robustness and resilience in our organizations. Sometimes it's core assets, sometimes it's IP, sometimes it's business relationships, and yes, sometimes it's cash. But the pandemic revealed a capacity for change and for mutual support that managements worldwide have always underestimated. Success now consists of doing work that matters alongside people you trust and care about. For organizations to be healthy and resilient requires that their people are healthy and resilient too. In many ways, I often think uncertainty is the only certainty that we have. And knowing how to live with it, knowing how to live with insecurity, is the only security we have. In an age of uncertainty, when so much remains unpredictable, we have no choice but to build more and gain more from the collective intelligence and creative intelligence of all of our people, to see them as sources of value, not cost, and to appreciate that the job of leaders is the same as it's always been, to build value through building social capital, through participation, experimentation, by listening, and by paying attention. That's how you build an early warning system and a rich collaborative network of creativity and improvisation. The potential rewards for all of us are huge because the greater the participation in decision-making, the faster implementing change becomes. You don't have to sell change to people who designed it. So it's fast, it's credible, and it's co-created by people who care. And that's what makes firms fit for the future, whatever the future may bring. Thank you very much.